June 23rd, 1997.
The Supreme Court reverses itself.
Can you give me an example of something that's a sin?
Allowing public school teachers to teach at religious schools.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Is the wall between church and state beginning to crumble?
This court is headed consistently in the direction of a more hospitable climate to religion in the lives of Americans.
We find that this is a major step backwards for religious liberty in the United States.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen.
Tonight, the fight over religion in our schools. The Supreme Court changes the rules.
This is ABC News Nightline. Substituting for Ted Koppel and reporting from Washington, Cokie Roberts.
Separation of church and state is one of those phrases we recite automatically as American dogma. But the question of just how separate the two institutions should be has plagued lawyers and lawmakers since the Bill of Rights was ratified. In recent decades, the Supreme Court has applied a strict standard, viewing with great suspicion anything that might look like the establishment of religion by the government. But that seems to be changing. Today, the court decided that disadvantaged children who are entitled to taxpayer-funded educational help can get that help in their own schools, even if those schools are church-run. The ruling raises questions about how far the court is willing to let the state go in assisting children in parochial schools, and whether the next step might be government vouchers for private education. Here's Nightline correspondent Chris Bury.
After Jesus sat down to eat, he took some bread.
The court ruled, in effect, that the separation of church and state at thousands of parochial schools, like Holy Spirit in the South Bronx, has been absolute to the point of absurdity.
Let us pray for the sick, the homeless, and the hungry.
At Holy Spirit, the law has led to a kind of reverse busing. All Catholic education is conducted inside the school, but when low-income students here attend remedial classes in reading and math, a program known as Title I, mandated by federal law, they must leave the school for mobile classrooms parked outside. The reason, these remedial classes are taught by public school teachers.
It costs about $16 million to administer this program on an annual basis.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son.
For other religious schools, such as St. Agnes in Arlington, Virginia, the problem is not so much the cost, but the confusion of moving students in the remedial program between public and private schools to fit the narrow letter of the law.
The difficulty is, it's so frustrating for parents who are both working jobs to come take the child out, transport the child down. Otherwise, we have to be concerned with security of the child and who takes care of them on the way in and the way out of school, and disruption of classrooms.
Today, in a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court agreed such restrictions are a waste of time and money, overturning its own 1985 decision. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, writing for the majority, said the remedial education program does not constitute improper government assistance to religion. It does not run afoul of any of 3 primary criteria, she wrote. It does not result in government indoctrination, define its recipients by their religion, or create an excessive entanglement between government and religion.
Today's decision signals a major sea change in the way school-based church-state jurisprudence is decided.
Lisa Thoreau, who heads a group advocating the separation of church and state, won the original case but lost today. She fears this decision opens the door to even more public financing of private education.
Right now, religious schools get a tremendous amount of state aid, from breakfast programs to busing of the kids to the religious schools to social workers to speech pathologists. They're already getting tremendous aid, and this will signal more aid is available.
Is everybody logged in?
Yes.
Let's begin.
Today's decision signals something even more important. Opponents and advocates agree this court might be more open to voucher programs like this one being tested in Milwaukee. Here, the state pays for low-income students to attend private schools by giving them vouchers. Supporters of such programs are greatly encouraged.
Today's decision recognizes that a carefully crafted program, secular program, with neutral criteria does not violate principles of separation of church and state. And that's what school choice proponents have been advocating for some time now.
We think vouchers are not far away based on this decision. I'm sure this decision gives voucher proponents a lot of encouragement and hopefulness because basically what the court has said is we can send public school teachers into religious schools today, and you know, if it's public schools today, perhaps it's cash grants tomorrow.
In striking down a 12-year-old decision, this court is saying it is open to new arguments on big questions like the separation of church and state. In a similar case, also by a 5-4 vote, the justices ruled in favor of a deaf student seeking access to a sign language interpreter paid by the government in a parochial school.
It looks like there are 5 solid votes for a position that says as long as the government is treating religion equally, as long as it's not picking among sects, and as long as it's not preferring religion to secular programs, then it's okay for the government to create programs that are going to benefit religious institutions along with secular ones.
What conclusion can you draw from this experiment about the heat? What happened to the heat?
But mixing public money and private schools is a tough balancing act, and the Clinton administration is caught in the middle. Today, the president, traveling in San Francisco, issued a statement saying he was pleased with the decision, which will raise educational standards of children across America. But the Clinton administration is also adamantly opposed to voucher programs for private schools.
That is a great mystery to us. It is irreconcilable, in our view, for the Clinton administration to oppose vouchers and support this kind of direct aid for religious schools, especially in urban areas.
Legal scholars say today's decision gives a green light to advocates of school choice in at least 2 other cases now making their way through the federal courts. This Supreme Court may not be knocking down the wall between church and state, but it does seem to be removing a brick or 2 at a time. This is Chris Bury for Nightline in Washington.
Today's high court decision is either a major breach in the wall separating church and state or good for teachers and children. 2 views when we come back.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by Ford.
Joining us from our New York bureau, Katherine Hickey, Superintendent of Schools for the New York Archdiocese, and here in Washington, Barry Len, Executive Director of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Ms. Hickey, does this decision make your life a whole lot simpler?
Not really, but it's a very fair, a just decision. We're delighted that children who really need services will be able to get them again where they really need to have them, within their own school buildings. Those services have been were provided for over 20 years until the Felton decision of 1985 took them away. So we have 20 years of success, 12 years of very spotty service to the children in our schools, and now the services have been returned. So it's a very good and positive thing.
Mr. Len, it does seem to be pretty silly to take kids out of class and march them into some trailer where the teacher will be helping them with their reading and math. Why is this something that you find so threatening?
Well, certainly the threat is to the 200-year tradition in this country that we had until today, at least, of not providing public school employees an opportunity to go in at taxpayer expense into private religious schools. And the 200-year principle is important for another reason. We decided 200 years ago that we would not, as a nation, fund religion. We wouldn't fund churches, synagogues. We also wouldn't fund the essential ministries of those institutions. Now, certainly Catholic schools are an essential part of the ministry and mission of the Roman Catholic Church.
But Ms. Hickey just said that they did do that for 20 years until the decision that was overturned today.
Well, of course, you have to bring these cases, and it took us some time to bring these cases to the Supreme Court, which properly decided them 12 years ago. I think the problem that we see here is that the separation of church and state is not just an abstract principle. As the dissenters in this case pointed out, one of the things that you lose when you have too close, too comfortable a relationship between religious organizations and government funding is that the religious institutions become dependent on those sources of government funding, and that government funding comes and goes at the whim of governments. The healthy relationship for these private religious schools is to go and to seek the funding for these very expensive programs from their believers and not expect to have every taxpayer pay for this and every other imaginable government program.
Ms. Hickey, what about that? Why not have Catholics pay for their kids in Catholic schools?
They are, and the Catholics are also paying for the kids in public schools. I would suggest very clearly that the issue is not services to Catholic schools or other religious schools. I would suggest very clearly that the services are provided to children, no matter in what building they take their studies.
But Ms.
We are not, we are not providing services. You are not giving money to our schools. You're not giving anything to our schools. You're not giving busing to our schools. You're not giving textbooks to our schools. You are giving these services to children, the children of the poor and the children of tax-paying citizens of this country.
Well,
so you are not giving a penny to our schools.
Well, of course, I mean, that's really silly because...
No, it's not silly. It is the absolute truth.
No, to the extent that we, the taxpayers, whether we're Catholics or not, are paying for those schools and some of the services in those schools, you have other monies freed up to do other things. But the interesting
Absolutely
thing is
not. We cannot afford the remedial services in our schools.
Excuse me, but Ms. Hickey, the nation's bishops for the past 50 years have been, along with their attorneys, before the United States Supreme Court, seeking not just this kind of assistance for remedial education, but computers, salaries of teachers, even the construction of new buildings. In other words, if we had it the way... Well,
that is absolutely
you were
not
arguing
true.
those cases in the 1940s and 50s before the United States Supreme Court, and our organization and many others were on the other side. But if you want the government to provide a public school system, as I certainly do, I don't think it is obliged to provide funds for your school system, the Nation of Islam system, and the
let me ask you this, though. If the government requires that these children, disadvantaged children, require this remedial education, doesn't the government have to provide it for them?
That's right. It is a federal law. Not necessarily. The law does not say in a public school. The law merely says that the services have to be provided to the children, and the services should be provided in the school that the parents of the child choose.
But of course, the option did exist to simply have students walk 2 blocks in the city of New York in most cases to obtain those services. If I could just finish, to obtain those services in a public school.
Absolutely not. Have you walked children 2 or 3 blocks through the city streets of New York through snow and rain and sleet and traffic?
Well,
what nonsense?
Well, most parents in this country don't.
It's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that in the first year after the 1985 decision, that kept the teachers from going into the schools, that in fact the participation in the remedial program dropped precipitously.
That's correct.
Of course, the other factor here is that many parents all over the United States watching this program find it absolutely absurd to believe that a child could not walk 2 blocks. I mean, my own daughter walked a mile just to get to the bus stop when we lived in the state of Virginia. I mean, Abraham Lincoln walked to school.
Well, Mr. Len, I think you can make a case that the times have changed and there are safety factors that were not there when Abraham Lincoln was walking.
But remember, the public school students have the same factors of safety to consider in New York.
And they're within their school buildings when they get remedial services,
they have to walk to those schools. I'm sorry, but they have to walk. What you really want are a special
not in the middle of the school day.
I want to move on to the question of what this means for other decisions coming down the pike from the Supreme Court on this question. And we will be joined in that discussion by Nightline's Nina Totenberg when we come back. We're back with Katherine Hickey and Barry Len, and joining us here in Washington, my colleague Nina Totenberg, legal affairs correspondent for National Public Radio and Nightline. Nina, this is a highly unusual thing, is it not, for the court to overturn one of its own decisions?
Well, it overturns its own decisions rarely, but never before has it done it in the very same case, that is, the case it originally ruled on.
And what does that mean to you in looking at other cases coming ahead?
Well, it means this was a 5-4 decision. The old one was a 5-4 decision. It very much means that it matters who appoints the next member of the Supreme Court and what seat is replaced. But you know, when you look at this decision overall, one does have to notice that the court struck down not just the New York ruling, but parts of a Michigan ruling from 1985. And that involved enrichment programs and music and art and physical education programs in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and enrichment math and enrichment English. And I think when you're looking at the long haul here, you really do have to ask if the government can pay for remedial aid for math and enrichment math courses, well, why not basic core math courses? And at some point, it does seem to me it is entirely possible that we will get back to the question of 30, 40, 50 years ago of whether parochial school aid education overall is permissible.
What's your response to that, Ms. Hickey?
I think we have to look to the concept of parental choice, the right of parents to choose the most appropriate educational environment for their children. The parents in our schools and all of the religious schools, as well as the public schools, are tax-paying citizens. They are being doubly taxed. They are supporting a public school system, and they are also paying tuitions and other fees to the religious schools. I think we have to try to be fair and try to look for the benefit of the children and try to look for what the parent chooses to be the most appropriate venue for their children.
Mr. Len, one of the other decisions that we're expecting this week is on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a wide-ranging piece of legislation that a lot of Americans don't know about that was passed in Congress a few years ago. Do you get any signals out of today's decision on that?
No, I don't. I think that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is an entirely separate matter, but I did get a very important clue on this voucher question from looking at Sandra Day O'Connor's opinion today. She said one of the reasons this program we've been discussing is constitutional is because no money ends up directly in the treasuries of the private religious schools. Now, under a voucher plan, what happens is a parent gets a voucher, turns it into the principal of the St. Anne's School. Principal of the St. Anne's School collects the vouchers, goes to the state treasury, and says not just show me the money, but give me the money. And that is just the kind of direct subsidy of religious education that I believe there will be members of the court, including Justice O'Connor, who will be very unsympathetic to declaring constitutional.
So you don't see this as the camel's nose?
No, I don't believe that this opens the door to vouchers.
I have to tell you, I have spent the day on the telephone with people on all sides of the ideological fence, including Barry Len, and he is the only one who thinks this decision today was good for vouchers, that vouchers can withstand it. No one else seems to think that.
Well, I would agree. Today was a very narrow decision.
It was a
you would agree that you would agree that it doesn't mean anything for vouchers?
I agree that it does not mean anything for vouchers. It was a narrow decision. It answered the question that was asked, and if anybody wishes to read anything into it, well, go ahead. But as far as we're concerned, it answered the question that was asked. It was a narrow decision. We're very happy with it.
Nina, what about this question, though, of overturning a case? Do you see this as now the camel's nose under the tent on that one, that every loser comes back to the court and tries again?
Well, Justice O'Connor tried to write an opinion that was as narrow as possible, and she said to the lower courts basically, don't you ever try doing this. Let us do this if we're ever going to do this again. But the dissenters, particularly Justice Ginsburg, said, you know, you have really violated our non-agenda-driven principles here by doing this for the first time.
I think there's a very legitimate fear that losers in cases involving free speech, voting rights, abortion will now decide to use a shortcut, claim that there's a manifest injustice that has been done, the same kind of language, frankly, that we've been hearing from Ms. Hickey tonight about why the Catholic school system should get more and more assistance. And as I said earlier...
I did not say anything about why the Catholic school system should get more and more assistance.
Double taxation. You've made the same criticism.
I am not talking about the Catholic school system. I am talking about parents having a choice. If the parents choose a public school, a religious school, or another private school, that's fine. It is parental choice. And hey, let's try it. Let's let it get to the Supreme Court and have the Supreme Court make the decision instead of us conjecturing.
We will see if that happens in another case on another time. But now we have to stop. Thanks very much, Katherine Hickey and Barry Len.
You're very welcome.
Nina Totenberg will be with us to talk about a couple of other decisions from the Supreme Court today when we come back.